Our priority has been to ensure that Canadians can continue to have confidence in our asylum system, in our refugee system. We need to recognize that there are larger numbers now than before because of global instability in terms of refugees. That's why we're putting more resources in, and we're also ensuring that the system is fair for everyone.
The Prime Minister is defending proposed changes to how people can file for asylum in this country. The federal government wants to prevent people from making refugee claims in Canada if they've made similar claims in one of the other Five Eyes countries. So that's, for example, includes the United States. It's calling that, quote, asylum shopping. The change is in response to the recent wave of asylum seekers arriving at Canada's border. About 40,000 of them have crossed into Canada between official points of entry since 2017. So how are refugee advocates responding? Lauren Waldman is Senior Counsel of Waldman & Associates, and he joins us now from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Waldman. Great to see you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for inviting me.
So under this proposed change to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, asylum seekers could be considered ineligible if they've claimed asylum in one of the Five Eyes countries prior to coming to Canada. So that includes the United States. What do you think of the change?
We're extremely disappointed that the government decided to make this change. First of all, to do it in a budget where there's not going to be a full debate because it's hidden in the Budget Implementation Act when it should be really a separate piece of legislation is improper in our view, and we would hope that the government will take it out of the budget and put it into a proper piece of legislation so that the issue can be properly debated. Secondly of all, we are deeply upset about it. Remember, this is a government that won the last election in large part because of its support for refugees. And now it's introducing a measure which is going to seriously undermine the fairness of the process whereby Canada decides whether or not to give protection to people who seek asylum. You know, the fundamental protection is to have...
How does it do that? Yeah.
Well, you have a hearing before an independent tribunal, the specialized tribunal, the Immigration and Refugee Board, which hears your case and makes a fair determination as to whether or not you're a refugee. Instead, people who are now ineligible won't get that hearing. They're going to get a paper review by an officer who's not from an independent tribunal but is an employee of the government who might conduct an oral hearing. And so the officers don't have the experience or the expertise that the tribunal does in conducting these hearings. And we think it's going to have a significant negative impact on the fairness of the process.
Can you help us understand, obviously you understand this from a different point of view than those of us who sort of just watch what's happening. You know, there's a lot of people who have said that it's a bit concerning that people are just walking across points of entry. And certainly, you're absolutely right, it's a political discussion, but just even average Canadians who watch that happen. The government says that it's trying to prevent quote-unquote asylum shopping. Would that actually do this?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't do it at all. I mean, this whole notion of people crossing the border as being illegal is completely wrong. Most asylum seekers can't get to Canada through legal means because they're required to apply for visas that they don't get. So most of my clients either come with an improper passport, and some of them cross the border irregularly from Canada. The question that Canadians have to ask in all of these cases is, are the people genuine refugees? And Canada wants to protect genuine refugees. That's what the Liberal government campaigned on. That's why the Canadians supported them. And what they're doing now is they're providing a less than fair process for determination of refugee claims by denying people the hearing before the independent tribunal. How people get to Canada and make asylum is irrelevant. The question that needs to be determined in each case is this person a genuine refugee? And you want to have a fair process. And the government, by taking this step, is eroding the fairness of that process.
Why is it irrelevant? Why is the means by which they get here irrelevant?
Because refugees don't have the luxury of, applying in the normal way and meeting the points. They're people who are fleeing for their lives. You know, we see the drama of the people getting on the boats crossing the Mediterranean. Well, the people who come to Canada irregularly through the United States, many of them have very harrowing stories to tell about how they managed to get here. And they choose not to claim in the United States, many of them, because they don't trust the current regime there because of the anti-immigrant policies of President Trump. And I think a lot of Canadians can understand why a person who is fleeing for their life would be reluctant to trust their fate to a government that's controlled by someone who makes anti-immigrant statements.
Were you surprised then in that climate, in this particular climate, to see this change being proposed? Because it does specifically identify Five Eyes countries, obviously of which the United States is one of them. Given what we've heard, the rhetoric we've heard on the issues we've seen on the southern border, for example, in the United States, were you surprised?
Yeah, I was very disappointed. You know, I think that it's based upon this whole policy decision is based upon the notion that people are going to be treated fairly in the United States. And I just, you know, having observed what's been happening in the United States since President Trump became the president, and in particular the anti-refugee rhetoric of the current administration, I find it hard to accept that our government would assert that people who come from the United States would be treated fairly there and don't have a valid reason for coming to Canada. Why do you think, I mean, before Trump was president, people weren't crossing the border in massive numbers. They crossed the border in response to the anti-refugee, anti-immigrant rhetoric of the Trump administration.
Is there any recourse now for people like you who think this is unfair? They obviously have a majority. This is attached to the budget implementation bill. Is there any recourse?
Yeah, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try and lobby Liberal MPs who we supported in the past and urge them to push back on the government against this anti-refugee policy. We're going to work with opposition parties, and then we'll obviously work with senators to try and convince them as well. And if none of that works, then obviously we'll look at legal challenges to the legislation.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Wildman. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
Earlier, I spoke to Lloyd Axworthy, a former Minister of Immigration. Here's the rest of that conversation. You're the chair of the World Refugee Council, and I know you hold that position in an official capacity, I'm sorry, but apart from that position, I want to ask you about something that the government is proposing, and they're proposing changes to the asylum system here, and they included them in the budget implementation bill that would make refugees ineligible to sort of make a claim if they've already done so in another country, one of the Five Eyes countries. We've heard some criticism from lawyers and advocates. They say that it's an attack on refugees. What do you think?
Well, I'm really disappointed that they've taken this step. I think that what I'd heard that the government was working on a much broader asylum bill, you know, that would pull in a number of, and what we forget is that the oldest human right in the world is the right of asylum. It goes back 20,000 years. It goes back to city-states in Greece and in the Middle East. The idea of sanctuary, that you can get protected against somebody who is trying to persecute you. And so all of a sudden you've got our friend to the south of us saying, let's get rid of asylum. So when I read a Canadian official justifying this act on the basis that there really isn't that much difference about how the United States and Canada processes refugee claims, I'm saying, what kind of world are you living in? And if I might just give you an example. About a month and a half ago, I was in the camps on the border around Tijuana when the Central Americans were still coming up. And I got into some discussions with women who were, you know, really quite agitated. They'd gone to the fence, they'd been pushed back, and they said, but what had happened to them, all the way along that long trek from Honduras, they'd been told that they could claim status based on domestic violence issues or gang violence. I mean, what more obvious criteria in places like Honduras? When they got to the border guards were saying, we don't recognize those criteria anymore. And so they were hitting a stone wall. What were they going to apply to? Now, will this legislation say, well, you've already made an application, and the fact that the Americans no longer recognize that criteria, that's your problem. It draws us in too close. I mean, I think right now people are looking for alternatives to the kind of anti-immigration efforts being made around the world. The Prime Minister in the first election made Canada really a leader. And I think issues like this begin to chip away at it.
They say that they want to prevent basically asylum shopping, the idea of,
you know something, that's an offensive statement. I know it was done by a minister of the Crown, but I think I'm old enough and been around enough. You know, there's so much effort to put the onus back on refugees as if somehow they're out there shopping to get in. They're escaping from terror, from violence, from starvation, from their families being persecuted. And let's stop treating them this way and using that kind of language. The fact of the matter is, it's the system that was set up right after 9/11, the so-called Safe Party Agreement, that causes the problem, because it's preventing refugees coming through the States to legally apply through our consulates or our embassy.
What has to happen to that agreement, do you think?
Well, it needs to put in abeyance until we figure the United States is that we're now compatible again. I have no problems working in the States, but not when you've got an immigration system that's being corrupted the way it is by Mr. Trump.
All right, I have to leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Axworthy.
Okay,
Pleasure
you're welcome.
to have you on. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
As you heard, there is some blowback about proposed changes to the rules for asylum seekers. Those changes are part of the budget implementation bill, which was tabled this week, and they will essentially make it harder for some refugees to claim asylum in Canada when not using official border points of entry. We're back with the Power Panel, Bruce, Amanda, Tim, and Kathleen. Essentially, Kathleen, what it is if you've applied for asylum in one of the Five Eyes countries, which includes the United States, you can't. The rule would be that you can't then apply for it again in Canada. What do you think?
But let's roll it back. We're in the middle of a global refugee crisis around the world. There are 68 million refugees worldwide. 25 of them are UN recognized. This government claims to be a humanitarian, compassionate leader. They cannot shut the border down right now. Let's talk about just our neighbor to the south with the U.S. They don't recognize anymore gender-based violence. So domestic violence, sexual violence. They don't recognize gang violence. Canadians at home would remember the story of the man, Seydou Mohammed, who crossed the border, Manitoba border, and lost his fingers in the dead of winter because it was so cold. That man, a LGBT refugee from Ghana, wouldn't be eligible under this new law. The way the Liberals are changing it. I think that they have to reverse this. There's a way to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement for just a 3-month period so they can see if we, in fact, are living up to what Canadians feel are humanitarian grounds. The reality is under Conservative and Liberal governments, we've underfunded the Immigration Refugee Board. It's not running the way it should be doing, and so that's why...
There is more money for it in the budget. We should be fair, but you're right. There are massive delays, and those delays have increased with the... I mean, what they're talking about here, Tim, is an issue that we've talked about often over the past 2 years, and that is the sheer number of people who have crossed by foot in between points of entry. And it's the Conservatives who have been very critical of them for not doing more. The NDP have also been critical on the front of more funding for the Refugee Board. They're doing something now to try and stem the numbers. Is it fair to... I don't know. I mean, obviously, it's fair to criticize them, but they're responding to a criticism that they were getting.
Well, I'd never pick a fight with Lloyd Axworthy because I'd lose, or one with Bill Belair because he's a pretty tough police officer. But his language is fascinating, right? Because it plays to the temperament of the times, and those who are frustrated with our immigration system believe it is weak, believe people are taking advantage of it. So the lexicon that Chief Blair is using fits that. It's a clear political play to try and address some of the vulnerabilities the government feels they have there, both in the West and Manitoba, which is an important area for them, and in Quebec. The bigger problem, I think, with this, to even be able to say if this was being addressed properly, then you got to have it as standalone legislation. And here's another Liberal contradiction, right? They were never going to do these big Harper-like omnibus bills. Well, they stick this in back on page 300 and something. So if they're really serious about it, and it is something that can be defended and something that is legitimate, bring it out, and have a fulsome debate, not pack it in there in the back and hope it gets in, not knowing what the consequences are or the impact of it will be.
Yeah, Bruce, that's one of the main criticisms coming today. Even if you think that there is some sort of measure that could be adopted to help with what some people see as an issue with people crossing in between points of entry, this is at the bottom of a budget implementation bill or attached to it, and therefore wouldn't get the same kind of debate if it were treated in a different manner.
Well, you're either humanitarian or not. I have to say that I do sympathize with the people that are coming and trying to get across these borders. They don't know that it's minus 40 degrees Celsius here, and it's a very dangerous situation. My relatives on my mother's side, after the Northwest Rebellion in Saskatchewan, they went down to the United States and formed a community there at Rocky Boy, Montana. They're still there, and they were in poverty. They were defeated. They were at least physically defeated. They were starving. They had to go there. Same with after the Wounded Knee massacre. The Dakota, some of them had to come up here for a while. We welcomed them. We tried to help them as much as we can. And I can certainly see the parallels that a lot of these people are going through in their home countries. And what is the answer? I don't know. I cannot invoke world peace.
Yeah, when we're talking about answers, Amanda, what do you think? I mean, Mr. Axworthy didn't mince any words there in criticizing, I guess, the language around asylum shopping. And I think, speaking to him after, he was a bit surprised given the Liberals' rhetoric so far, I guess, on the issue and their sort of defense of accepting these asylum seekers.
Yeah, well, I think it's really difficult to paint this Liberal government with an unsympathetic brush when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers. I think that's almost impossible. I don't think that there's a government that's done more, frankly. I think the Prime Minister has also been crystal clear on this. Coming out of the budget, talked about the fact that he's, obviously strongly in favor, will continue to be strongly in favor of our immigration and our immigration system, speaks very positively about it, despite the fact that we're in this politically charged environment. But the fact of the matter is we have over 40,000 asylum seekers crossing at unofficial checkpoints. The RCMP has requested funds to beef up enforcement so that we can move to official checkpoints, but also funding within this budget went to speeding up asylum claims. So again, very difficult to paint this one-sided stroke when obviously this is about processing more quickly, making sure that it's going through the right channels, and that we keep a strength in our borders and help our RCMP enforce what's there.
I don't think anyone's trying to paint the whole suite of measures.
Well, I think
one stroke, but I get that.
I think Kathleen said
this one move. I mean, it does have repercussions when you consider that the sort of environment in the United States. I think that's the main question that's being raised, right? Like, can we consider an asylum claim rejected in the United States valid, given the way in which refugees are viewed there now, given the policy of the administration there?
But this is the problem with when we have these politically charged conversations, because I think Kathleen started by saying now is not the time to shut down our borders. Borders are not being shut down. In fact, part of the funding against this is about processing more quickly, speeding up asylum claims. That's part of what was in the budget.
No, this is actually going to delay. No, that's actually not true.
The totality of the issue. It actually is true.
No, it means actually if they fail, they're now forcing refugees, if they get declined the first time, they'll have to wait another year and they'll have to appeal through the process. So that's the thing is, as opposed to pursuing a compassionate or humanitarian grounds application. But just let's talk politics for a second. That's why we're here political strategists. The 2015 election turned on a very sad story about Alan Kurdi.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that was a pivotal moment in the campaign. A small Syrian boy who passed away trying to flee the conflict there. Right now, we have a government that is concerned, the Liberal government is concerned about what the Conservatives are doing on the refugee and immigration issue. So this is a shield issue for them. They are trying to basically create no light between Conservatives and Liberals on this, and they are not creating the right policy. They are choosing politics over the correct policy, and they are actually walking away from their humanitarian and compassionate responsibility to the 68 million refugees across the globe right now. We are in a crisis.
I think 3,000, and I'll correct myself if I'm wrong later, 3,000 of the 40.
But even more specifically, if you're comfortable if you're comfortable in your response, you're comfortable in the integrity of the system and the policy ideas you're offering, don't stick it in the back of an omnibus budget. Bring it all forward.
Yeah.
Sure. Let's
Take
debate
it out.
it.
Okay, we got to go. Thank you very much to the Power panel. Thanks to Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, Kathleen Monk, and Bruce Spence.